July 17, 1944. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was absolutely certain he could still control the battle for Normandy. He had survived minefields in Africa, tank duels in the desert, and 3 years of war against the best the Allies could send. He had positioned himself exactly where a commander needed to be, at the front, reading the battlefield, making decisions in real time. But Rommel was making a fatal calculation error. He thought his greatest threat was the enemy he could see. The tanks, the infantry, the artillery divisions massing near Cong. He didn't realize that. By 1944, the real enemy was invisible. Erwin Rommel was 52 years old in the summer of 1944. He was Germany's most famous soldier, the man who had earned his Knight's Cross in 1940 by leading the Ghost Division across France faster than anyone thought possible. The man who had chased the British across North Africa for 2 years, earning the nickname Desert Fox from his own enemies. Churchill himself had praised him in Parliament. He was a legend built on speed, intuition, and personal presence on the battlefield. His entire career was built on the idea that a general who moves faster than his enemy wins. In France in 1940, he had outrun his own supply lines. In Libya, he had appeared behind British positions before they knew he had moved. He believed that war was decided by men who could read the terrain, sense the moment, and act before the enemy could react. Since D-Day, June 6th, he had been trying to apply these same principles to the defense of Normandy. He drove thousands of kilometers in his Hawk staff car, visiting headquarters, pushing his men to counterattack, demanding speed. He operated under the belief that he was still fighting a war of maneuver. But the chessboard had changed. Every time Rommel ordered a division to move, it didn't arrive on time. Every time he planned a counterattack, the fuel trucks were burning on the roadside before they reached the tanks. He was a commander, trying to play speed chess while his opponent was simply setting the board on fire. When Rommel had first arrived in France in late 1943, he had been shocked by what he found. The vaunted Atlantic Wall, the fortress that German propaganda promised would throw any invasion back into the sea, was a myth. The bunkers were incomplete. The minefields were thin. The beach obstacles were poorly positioned. German units were under strength and scattered across hundreds of kilometers of coastline. So Rommel did what Rommel always did. He compensated with energy, with presence, with sheer force of will. From December 1943 through the spring of 1944, he drove relentlessly along the coast of France. He personally counted obstacles. He walked in the sand. He inspected gun emplacements. He demanded more concrete, more mines, more barbed wire. He told his staff the first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. It will be the longest day. By mid-July, the strain was visible on his face. He wrote to his wife Lucy about the crushing material superiority of the enemy. He described the frustration of watching his carefully planned counterattacks dissolve before they could begin. He wrote about the constant presence of enemy aircraft, the impossibility of moving anything in daylight, the feeling of fighting with his hands tied behind his back. But crucially, he still trusted his personal luck. He refused to travel at night because he needed to see the terrain. He relied on his driver's skill to spot danger. He believed that if he moved fast enough, he could slip through the gaps. What he didn't grasp was that there were no gaps left. The gap was a concept from terrestrial warfare. In the three-dimensional war of 1944, the enemy was everywhere because the enemy was the sky itself. Rommel looked up and saw clouds. But the data told a different story. A story of American and British industrial output that had become a mathematical certainty. By July 1944, the Allies were flying over 13,000 sorties a day. The sheer volume of machinery overhead was staggering. It wasn't just about pilot skill. It was about factory output. For every German engine in the air, there were 20 Allied engines. Numbers were relentless. American factories alone were producing over 8,000 aircraft per month. The training schools in Texas, Arizona, and California were graduating thousands of pilots every week. The fuel refineries in Oklahoma and Louisiana were pumping millions of barrels of high-octane aviation gasoline. This was not an air force. This was an industrial conveyor belt that happened to have wings. For RML, sitting in his headquarters at La Rung, this industrial statistic had a terrifying practical reality. He was going blind. His reconnaissance planes couldn't fly. The few that tried were shot down within minutes. He couldn't see what the Allies were doing behind the lines. But they could see everything he did. Every truck, every tank, every staff car raising dust on a country road. The weapon of choice for this dominance wasn't just the heavy bomber. It was the Jobbo, the fighter bomber. Aircraft like the Hawker Typhoon and the Supermarine. Spitfire had been transformed from dog fighters into low-level executioners, powered by high-octane American aviation fuel, a resource Germany was critically running out of. These machines could loiter over the battlefield for hours. They carried 20mm cannons that fired explosive shells at 600 rounds per minute. A single 3-second burst could put over 60 high-velocity shells into an area the size of a living room. The pilots flying these aircraft were not aces hunting for glory. They were workers on a production line. Their job was simple: find anything that moves and destroy it. Trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, motorcycles, staff cars, anything with an engine was a target. They flew in shifts from dawn to dusk, sector by sector, road by road, methodically erasing the German army's ability to function. RML felt this pressure personally. He noted in his reports that his own troops were terrified to move. Soldiers who had faced Soviet tanks, without flinching, now refused to drive in daylight. Entire convoys sat motionless under trees, waiting for darkness, while the front line crumbled from lack of supplies. He saw the wrecks on the side of the road every day. The burned trucks, the shattered tanks, the bodies of drivers who had gambled and lost. Yet on July 17th, he convinced himself that the rules didn't apply to him. He needed to get to the headquarters to salvage the crumbling front. The situation was desperate. The British were pressing toward Kong. The Americans were preparing something big in the West. Every mattered. The urgency of the situation on the ground blinded him to the probability curve in the sky. He was betting his life against an industrial system that produced planes faster than Germany could produce bullets. It was late afternoon, July 17th. RML left the headquarters of Sape Dietrich. The meeting had been tense. Dietrich had painted a grim picture of the front. Units were dissolving. Replacements weren't arriving. Fuel was almost gone. The front was breaking, and there was nothing Dietrich could do to stop it. RML was anxious to return to his own headquarters at La Rung. He needed to send another report to Berlin. Another plea for reinforcements that would never come. Another warning that the situation was approaching catastrophe. He checked his watch. It was approaching 1,800 hours. The sun was still high. The route led him along the N179 road near Leo. It was a long straight stretch of French asphalt cutting through the Normandy countryside. In 1940, RML would have raced down this road at the head of a tank column, conquering France in 6 weeks. In 1944, it was a kill zone. His driver, Sergeant Daniel, knew the dangers. He had been driving Rommel for months. He had learned to watch the sky as much as the road. He kept the car close to the hedge when possible, using the shadows for concealment. He varied his speed to avoid creating a predictable dust trail. But RML urged him to speed up. They were moving through a gap in the cloud cover. The sun came out bright and warm on the Normandy fields. For a tactical commander on the ground, sunlight is usually good. It allows you to see the terrain, to spot the enemy, to read the battlefield. For a target in Normandy, sunlight was a death sentence. It meant shadows, contrast, and visibility from 5,000 feet. In the back seat, RML studied his maps, making notes for the report he would write that evening. Beside him sat Captain Helmuth Lang, his aide, and Major Neuhaus, a liaison officer. They discussed the meeting with Dietrich, the shortage of fuel, the impossible mathematics of the defense. RML was gambling. He calculated that he could race between the patrol sectors of the Allied aircraft. He assumed the Yavos were busy over the main battle area at Kong, where the British were pressing their attack. He thought he knew the patterns. He thought he could predict the gaps. He was wrong. High above, scanning the sector, was not a heroic night of the air, but a routine patrol. Section Blue of number 600 to Squadron, Royal Air Force, to Spitfires cruising at 4,000 feet, looking for targets. They weren't hunting specifically for a field marshal. They had no idea who was on that road below them. They were workers on a shift doing their job, looking for any machinery that moved. When they saw the dust cloud of Rommel's car, they didn't see a legend. They didn't see the man who had chased the British across North Africa. They didn't see Germany's most famous soldier. They just saw a target. This is the moment where the abstract numbers of industrial production condense into a single violent event. The lead pilot spotted the staff car first, a dark shape trailing dust on a straight stretch of road. No escort vehicles, no visible anti-aircraft protection, just a single car moving fast, exposed. He radioed his wingman. Target spotted. Road junction grid reference. The voice was calm, professional. This was routine. They had done this dozens of times before. Pilot Charley Fox rolled his Spitfire into a shallow dive. He didn't need to know who was in the car. The system had done its work. It had placed a gun platform in the right sky at the right time. All he had to do was aim and fire. The Spitfire descended rapidly, the engine note rising to a scream. From the cockpit, the car grew from a speck to a shape to a vehicle with visible wheels and windows. The pilot aligned his gun sight, the crosshairs settling on the dark rectangle of the car's roof. In the car below, Sergeant Daniel heard at first the rising snarl of an aircraft engine, different from the distant drone they had been hearing all day. This was close. This was coming toward them. He looked up through the windshield and saw the shape diving out of the sun. He shouted a warning and yanked the wheel, trying to swerve off the road, trying to find cover that didn't exist. But the math was impossible. The aircraft was closing at 350 miles per hour. The car was doing perhaps 50. The distance between them was shrinking at nearly 600 feet per second. RML looked up from his maps. Perhaps he saw the dark shape against the bright sky. Perhaps he felt the car lurch as Daniel tried to evade. Perhaps for one fraction of a second, he understood what was about to happen. The pilot pressed the button. The Hispano cannons roared. In less than 2 seconds, a stream of high-explosive shells walked across the road and smashed into the HCH. The physics were brutal. A 20mm shell doesn't just puncture, it explodes. Each round carried enough energy to punch through light armor and detonate inside, spraying fragments in every direction. The first shells hit the road surface, throwing up geysers of asphalt and dirt. Then the stream walked up the length of the vehicle. The driver was hit instantly, his left arm and shoulder shattered by multiple impacts. He lost control immediately, his hands falling from the wheel. The car, now a careening ton of metal with no one steering, veered off the road at high speed. It slammed into the ditch, the front wheels digging into the soft earth. The momentum flipped the rear end upward. The vehicle rolled, metal screaming against stone. Rommel, the man who had survived the entire North African campaign, was thrown forward with tremendous force. His head struck the windshield pillar, a thick steel bar designed to hold the roof in place. His skull fractured in 3 places. The impact was so severe that fragments of bone were driven into his brain. His left eye socket was crushed. Glass and metal fragments tore into his face. The plane pulled up and flew away, its engine note fading into the distance. The pilot noted staff car damaged in his log. He checked his fuel gauge, confirmed his position, and turned back toward base. There would be tea waiting, perhaps a debriefing, then another patrol in the morning. He had no idea he had just decapitated the German defense of Normandy. On the ground, Captain Lang crawled out of the wreckage, bleeding from cuts on his face and hands. The car lay on its side in the ditch, one wheel still spinning slowly. Smoke rose from the engine compartment. He found the field marshal lying on the grass beside the road, thrown clear by the impact. RML was unconscious, blood pouring from his head wounds, his breathing shallow and irregular. For a moment, they thought he was dead. The Desert Fox had been neutralized not by a better strategist, not by a superior army, not by a rival general's brilliant maneuver, but by a machine built in a factory flown by a pilot who didn't know his name, armed with shells manufactured on another continent. RML was rushed to a nearby military hospital in Burnett. French civilians watched the convoy pass, not knowing that the bandaged figure in the back of the ambulance was Germany's most famous soldier. The diagnosis was severe: a fracture at the base of the skull, 2 fractures on the temple and cheekbone, a destroyed left eye socket, and severe damage to the left side of his brain. The surgeons operated immediately, drilling into his skull to relieve the pressure from the swelling. For days, his survival was in doubt. He drifted in and out of consciousness, unable to speak, unable to recognize the officers who came to his bedside. While surgeons fought to save his life, the German front in Normandy collapsed. The one man who might have rallied the defense, who might have improvised some desperate counterstroke, was in a coma. The panzer divisions he had tried so hard to coordinate received no orders. The counterattacks he had planned never materialized. On July 20th, 3 days after the attack, a bomb exploded at Hitler's headquarters in Rustenburg. The assassination attempt failed, but it triggered a massive purge across the Wehrmacht. Officers were arrested by the hundreds. Some were executed within hours. The Gestapo began investigating anyone who might have had contact with the conspirators. RML, lying helpless in a hospital bed, was swept up in the orbit of suspicion. Some of the conspirators had mentioned his name. Some had hoped to use his prestige in a post-Hitler government. Whether Rommel knew of the plot or not became irrelevant. In the paranoid atmosphere of the Nazi regime, suspicion was enough. But he was not there to defend himself. He was not at a briefing, not in a bunker, not at a forward command post, where he could use his reputation and his connections to protect himself. He was on a hospital bed, his head wrapped in bandages, his career already taken from him by an Allied pilot's trigger finger. He would never return to the front. The injury from the air attack had effectively ended. His military career before the Gestapo even knocked on his door. He was removed from the board. But the most shocking part of this story is not the injury itself. It is the anonymity of it. In previous wars, a general might fall leading a charge, recognized by his enemies, honored even in death. Admirals went down with their ships. Generals died with their standards in their hands. Here, Rommel was struck down by a pilot who didn't know his name, flying a plane built in a factory thousands of miles away, fueled by oil pumped from wells in Texas, armed with shells manufactured in Birmingham. The pilot went home for tea. He probably never learned whom he had hit. It was the ultimate triumph of the system. The Allied war machine didn't need to target RML specifically. It didn't need intelligence reports on his movements. It didn't need commandos or assassins. It simply saturated the environment with so much lethality that RML's survival became statistically impossible. Sooner or later, his movements would intersect with someone else's patrol pattern. On July 17th, the probability curve finally caught up with him. In October 1944, the Nazi regime decided that it no longer needed him alive. Generals Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Missel arrived at his home in Herlingen with a simple proposal. Take the cyanide capsule and your family will be spared. Refuse and you will face a show trial. RML accepted the poison. He died not on a battlefield, but in the back of a car on a quiet road near his home. What happened on July 17, 1944 proved the final thesis of World War II. Individual valor holds no weight against industrial supremacy. RML was a tactical genius. He had better instincts than almost any Allied commander. He could read a battlefield the way a musician reads a score. He understood timing, tempo, and the psychology of his opponents. In a different era, he would have been remembered as one of history's great captains. But in 1944, instincts were obsolete. You cannot outmaneuver a production line. You cannot flank a supply chain that spans the Atlantic. You cannot improvise your way out of a probability curve that has already calculated your death. The Americans and British had built a system where the death of an enemy field marshal was just a statistical probability. A routine outcome of putting thousands of planes in the air. No intelligence breakthrough. No special operation. Just the cold mathematics of industrial production applied to warfare. Every Spitfire that took off from an English airfield represented not just a machine, but an entire civilization at its back. The aluminum came from Canadian mines. The engine was designed by British engineers. The fuel was refined from American oil. The ammunition was manufactured in factories, staffed by women who had never seen a battlefield. The pilot was trained in a program that produced thousands of identical pilots every month. Against this system, what could one man do? Even the Desert Fox, RNL's fatal calculation, was thinking. He was playing a game of skill when he was actually trapped in a game of volume. He thought the war was still about generals and divisions, about maneuver and counterattack. He didn't understand that the war had become about factories and fuel depots, about shipping lanes and production quotas. The pilot went home, the factory kept producing, and the general was erased. When we look back at the wreck of Rommel's car, we see the end of the heroic age of warfare. From this point on, if you cannot control the sky, you cannot command the ground. If you cannot match the enemy's production, you cannot win, no matter how brilliant your tactics. RML died later by forced suicide, a political victim of a regime that was consuming itself. But his military death happened on that road near Saint-Fou-de-Montgomery. It was a 3-second burst of fire that announced the new reality of war. The era of the general was over. The era of the engineer had begun. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe. We don't just tell stories of heroism. We analyze the systems that actually decided the war. Let us know in the comments. Do you think Rommel could have changed the outcome in Normandy if he had survived that day? Or was the industrial gap simply too great to overcome? For more stories about how technology defeated tactics, check out this video here on the screen. This is Tales of Valor.